Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Q&A with an expert seminar series. We have 11 people on with us. And I'm really excited for today's talk. We're going to hear from Jessica Russo, who works in data visualization and advocacy. She's going to share with us her journey in data viz and her experience working with a variety of stakeholders. And so stick around for this. It's going to be fun. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We're going to power through the presentation and then have a massive Q&A session at the end. It's today. That's the format for today. But please ask questions in the chat as you have them. I'll flag them and make sure we come to them at the when we finish the presentation. And with that, Jessica, ready?
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Zane.
Your show.
I will try to zoom through this presentation so that we can get to as many questions as possible. So, hi, I'm Jessica. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share, like Zane said, I'm going to share about my journey to working at the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, where I use data viz and advocacy from things like offshore wind to transportation to biomass, right whales, heat pumps, electrification, you name it. So the people that I work with at NRDC and our partners are people like advocates, scientists, policymakers, lawyers, and they all have different levels of experience in data and design. But I work with them to tell their own stories and to find stories in data. We focus on audience and we focus on a call to action often. I'm going to show some process work here, but I'm going to try to emphasize the importance of onboarding a new project, incorporating meaningful and engaged critique, and then that focus on audience and calls to action. So I'm going to start with my journey to NRDC. Here is a visual resume showing my somewhat circuitous career path. This was inspired by Ali Torban's How I Spent My Time, the stream graph chart. So after graduating from Northwestern, I taught second grade in Harlem through Teach for America. After that, I began working at Bomber, a luxury ski company owned by Bodie Miller. And during this time, I volunteered as a teaching artist with Art Start, who operates in after-school programs in supportive housing for families around New York City. Around here, I joined a group that was shooting a documentary about the world's newest thru hike. So I hiked for about 2 months on the Te Aroa Trail in New Zealand. And when I got back, I started taking design courses and designing skis at Bomber, and also starting my own freelance design and illustration company. When I first started at NRDC in 2018, I used my design background to create blog illustrations and infographics like these two. So the left is a Block Island wind farm infographic. This was made after a trip with the Blue Green Alliance and my colleague Nathaniel Green. And then the one on the right is an infographic for Resilient Power Puerto Rico, which was made into a series of Instagram posts and also included in the comic book La Borinqueña, which was co-produced by one of my colleagues at NRDC. This project here contributed some communication power to a much larger project in Puerto Rico. This project wound up receiving over $1 billion for distributed solar and battery systems in Puerto Rico to help with resiliency, specifically after hurricanes. Early on, I also worked on some animations for climate and clean energy and for the whales team around their ropeless fishing campaign to protect North Atlantic right whales from getting entangled in fishing gear. So this is just a clip from a 1.5-minute long video used for the Future is Ropeless campaign on social media and at the Boston Seafood Expo. I also worked on infographics like this one. This was a heat pump infographic created for an issue brief, which is a short document. It summarizes a topic, it provides recommendations and actions on it. They're often used in advocacy efforts to educate policymakers on important issues, and they're usually about 1 to 2 pages. So this would be like a header image. But I found myself wanting to work with data more and more. So In 2022, I started a master's program at MICA, and last winter, I graduated with a master's in data visualization and analysis. And I won the capstone project for my project, Beyond Crisis, Lives Saved. This was a website, or is a website, a resource for friends and family of those suffering from opioid use disorder. It's meant to demystify opioids and fentanyl and provide some hope around where we can go from here. So this is just a brief scroll through of the site, part of the site. The top here is an overview of the epidemic. It explains how we arrived at nearly 100,000 deaths per year from opioids due to the actions of big pharma, the increased production of illicit fentanyl, and the impact of the pandemic. I also incorporated my illustrations into the website to make this more approachable considering the audience here. I've also been keeping up that freelance work, doing illustration, design, animation, and data visualization. So just quickly, I'll show you a recent map that I worked on for a restaurant on Long Island. Okay, back to NRDC and advocacy. Since I graduated from MICA, I've been working in graphic design, illustration, and data visualization here at NRDC. I create logos, websites, infographics. I do data analysis and visualization using R, coding, and other tools like you see here, Adobe Suite, Figma, Flourish, Tableau, Data Wrapper. So I'm going to use some of my projects to discuss the importance of onboarding and critique, audience, and considering your stakeholders during your project processes. Onboarding to start. So it's really important in my work where time is really valuable and my organization works across a variety of teams. Like I could get a request from the buildings team or power or nature or transportation. So I use Asana for project intake to keep communication clear and to be transparent about my workload. My creative request form includes questions like the one here on the screen, and also questions like, where would it live? Who is this for? Who's the audience? What are the top line items to get across? What's history in the region? Or what is the history with this community? What are the risks? What factors could weaken our case? And do we need to proactively address them? What data is available that could strengthen our case? Is the audience familiar with that data? Who is considered to be an expert? What would a successful outcome look like? So with this in mind, earlier this year, I worked with my colleague, Guillermo Ortiz, and members of the Moving Forward Network, or MFN, to create a 2-page leave behind for MFN to use in meetings with the EPA and the White House around the possibilities and benefits of electrifying freight trucking. So the prompt for this project was, how does MFN mobilize grassroots members in a way that brings them up to speed on this? It's called the Phase 3 GHG rule. It's about trucking, electrifying trucks, which it's something that this group, MFN, has already been advocating for. But how do they use this as a tool to communicate and leave information with the White House and EPA? So some of the top takeaways that I heard were diesel's burning the money on other people's lungs and health, that there's federal funding plenty to go around, there's private and utility sector investments, there are proactive measures being taken to address barriers. But I also heard my coworkers say that there was this myth. This kept coming up, like there are these myths that we hear. And there's this one big myth that we're going to turn on a light switch tomorrow and everything for electric vehicles will be rolled out. But demand is by 2035. We have to have a realistic timeline approach. With all of the innovative discoveries we've made over the last 11 years, why can't we figure out how to deploy this infrastructure? So I thought that framing was really interesting, and I started sketching, which is what I always do. I always start with sketches, helps get your brain moving. And Guillermo and I worked iteratively with folks from MFN to figure out what key information we wanted in this document. And we landed on this concept of the truth behind the pushback, which is really like common things that you hear from the industry that lawmakers would hear from the industry and what we believe and know to be true. So the goal of this project was twofold. So one was to get the EPA to do something about heavy duty trucks, which are the most polluting in communities, especially communities of color. And two, to give something to members and organizers of MFN so that they can understand these connection points between issue and solution, and what we're arguing. So information that's accessible allows them to advocate effectively in front of the EPA and White House staff, and something that they can leave behind. So MFN members said that they heard politicians say, we keep hearing about industry having all these troubles. So MFN should feel comfortable. These members should feel comfortable using the fact sheets to say that, heavy duty charging is not an unsolvable problem. For goal 2, we wanted to provide this tool that connected these talking points. So I illustrated MFN members from across the country, and we featured some of their comments from testimony and elsewhere. I recently heard last week at a conference, Jill Sherman Warren, who's the executive director of Native American Environmental Protection Coalition. Her advice around messaging networks is that for communities to understand and hear us out, we need to look familiar. We need to take information and apply it to the local community. So content needs to look like the communities that we're serving. So I wanted to feature real members, and I'll also point out that this is within the MFN brand guidelines. So it's really coming from their voices. Audience. Okay, so often I'll hear my colleagues try to claim that there isn't an audience that they're trying to reach, that they want to reach the most broad possible audience, that their audience is Americans. But I'm going to show you a silly example now of why knowing your audience to tell your messaging is so important. And this is something I saw this morning. So I saw both of these signs while walking my dog this morning, and it's clear who these signs are targeted towards: dog walkers or dog owners, and it's clear what they want from you. But are these messages effective? Does this stop a dog walker from allowing their dog to go in this spot? The first sign is somewhat shaming, in my opinion, and the second shows appreciation for a behavior. Both signs have a call to action, but these messages, however tailored to their specific audience, don't understand the audience enough to achieve these goals. However, I also saw this message this morning. This is in an area that's been planted as a rain garden to absorb runoff and help with drainage. This sign does not acknowledge dog walkers at all. However, I'm much more hesitant to allow my dog near a bed with a bright orange sign with a skull and crossbones on it. This sign provides clear information and a call to action without targeting dog owners specifically. I find this one to be much more effective. So, calls to action are key in the ask, the call to action. So if the person I'm working with is unsure of their call to action, I might show them this slide to help them brainstorm. So what are you asking your audience? These are all, words help trigger them. I'm going to show you some examples of my work, with that audience and messaging in mind. I'll turn to my next example now. Okay. So issue brief visuals. I mentioned issue briefs before, but this is a very different project from that Moving Forward Network project. This was for the carbon reduction program. So the audience for this project was politicians, to let them know that the carbon reduction program is something that we can win on, to state departments of transportation. They're all working independently. So we wanted to provide one resource so that they could see what other states are doing. And the third group would be other advocates. So it shouldn't seem so technical that advocates couldn't use it to promote. So my graphics here are a lot simpler. So with that in mind, I created a bunch of pull out quote type graphics, featuring data that was written in the report. So these could be shared by politicians or other advocates in their own work as key takeaways from the issue brief. I worked with the advocate and analyst on this project to create visuals for data points throughout the entire paper. I also created custom icons based on NRDC's brand guidelines to describe different types of public engagement. So this is, easy to understand at a glance. These infographics help get the point across to policymakers who are getting pulled in many different directions at once, and they can easily at a glance see what we're talking about here. I also use those same icons in an infographic in the issue brief to explain two different approaches the departments of transportation could take on this carbon reduction program. So one being a mandated spending approach, and the other was more of a guidance approach. So again, these are easy explainers for busy people. You can see using color and also separation that money would be ineligible in this mandated spending approach, and the guidance approach is really a checklist of what projects would be accepted. Okay, critique. Critique is a skill. You need to develop it and practice it. So critique's a form of feedback meant to provide guidance by identifying concerns and insights about the work being presented. So it's up to the designer to take the insights and make decisions about progressing the design. As a critiquer, it's really important to lead with questions. Show an interest in the process of the person you're critiquing, learn about their objectives, and don't assume. So find out the reasoning behind their thinking, behind their constraints, and behind other variables that went into the process. When you're receiving feedback, you want to make sure that you're actively listening and try avoid defending. That's hard because you want to stick up for your work, but it's important to hear people out. Also, it's important to remember the purpose. So understanding and improvement, not judgment. You always want to think before you're responding when you're receiving feedback. Consider if you really understand what that person is saying. And remember, as the designer, it's always your choice what feedback to use and what to include. Okay, so this last piece of work that I'm going to share is my contribution to my colleague Mohit Chhabra and Dylan Sullivan's paper for this year's ACEEE summer study. It was titled, "Doing the Right Thing Now Will Eventually Pay Off. Cost-effective and equitable building decarbonization requires proactive planning and rethinking rate design." What a mouthful. So this one was a much more analysis-heavy project. I cleaned and analyzed data in R, created charts in that program before exporting them to SVGs for editing in Illustrator. And the audience for this paper was very different. It was other energy efficiency nerds. So I took a very different approach to the layout of the data and how information was presented for this project. So as I said, this work was presented at the ACEEE Summer Study Conference, which was just held this past summer. And since the paper would be presented in person on a slideshow, and I knew that we'd be explaining this topic pretty quickly, even to nerds or people with a bunch of different background who are really passionate about energy efficiency, we went through a really long critique process and iterated on the presentation so that we were clear with our audience. We presented it to a lot of different people who had experience with energy efficiency and those who didn't, to gather tons of feedback. So we decided to include some explanatory charts like this one, and also these, which explain the axes before we get to the final chart. So the chart is grayed out in the background, and I explain what the Y and X axes are. Then we explain what each of the lines and dots, all of the data points are on this chart. We go through the legend for the reader, and then we show the chart. So we try to help the viewer understand these complex topics piece by piece so that they can keep pace with the presentation. I find that, and hopefully you're not experiencing this now, if someone goes too fast or if it's a new chart type that I haven't seen before, I find it harder to keep up with a presentation. So I'm going to click through a few of these charts that I worked on for this project without getting too far into the policy and boring you all with all that in the weeds knowledge. But I wanted to let you all know that our research findings included that switching from gas appliances to electric heat pumps would be cost effective in almost every state if we have proactive power planning. Our rates, our electricity and our gas rates don't reflect societal costs of the usage, and they show inaccurate signals. So they discourage cost-effective building electrification. And then 3, that pushing electrification under what the rates that we have now might lead to some regressive outcomes in states. So this last point, although we emphasize it in the paper, we got some pushback from internally because that's not something that our advocates really want to focus on. So instead of burying it, because we want to make sure that we're presenting all of the data that we uncover, we emphasize it in the paper. And we also note that we dug further into the data to look at the bottom 20% of wage earners to see where advocates could make the most impact for the people with the most need. So we identified priority states where rate design would have the most impact for electrification and attaining those progressive outcomes. We identified the states right here where there was higher distortion and there was a larger population that could show where intervention would ensure clean energy expansion. And we shared the data in multiple ways to appeal to this audience. This chart shows the difference between savings to society, which is social marginal cost, and savings to customers or their operating costs when electrifying their heat and hot water. So ideally, the difference would be 0, but all of these red dots you see on the screen show where customers are being discouraged to electrify more than necessary. So this specific map was only created after we shared these 2 charts with one of our colleagues, and they requested a new view on this topic that they might be able to share with policymakers or other advocates that would make a little more sense. This project took months to complete. It required really clear communication, loads of critique, analysis, and experimenting with data and with these visualizations. This was my first really big project working almost all in R. And I'm going to share this meme because it does a good job of expressing how I feel. I'm definitely not a pro at coding, but when I work through my code, I obviously Google, and I also relied on ChatGPT a lot to sort through information from GitHub and elsewhere on the internet and help me with my code. So that's something that I still am working with artificial intelligence and how I use it in my work or in my freelance work. I tend not to use any of the image generators, or I have never used an image generator. But for coding, I have used ChatGPT, and I wanted to share some of the questions that I will ask ChatGPT. So this one's a little self-explanatory. So ChatGPT will provide step-by-step explanations that really help me learn. They help me call out errors on my own later on because I can see where I've made mistakes in the past. You can copy and paste your code directly in. Or you can, if you're working with sensitive data, you can provide just like a sample of the code without going into the data. Here's a long one that I asked recently about creating dummy data. So for this one, I gave parameters for columns, and I requested a dummy data set written in R so that I could lay out my plan for mapping a visualization, take that code into R, come out with the data set, and think through possibilities of a dashboard in Tableau. Another great question for ChatGPT is help with writing regular expressions in R. So regular expressions are a sequence of characters, or even just one character that describes a certain pattern that's found in your data. So it could be like, does the data contain this specific date? Or, find everything in this year, or change all of the date formats so that they match up this way. Or find a case number or a series of case numbers and pull out that data. So regular expressions I find to be really tricky, and ChatGPT does a great job of writing those for you. That being said, I would just say consider tools to help you work smarter, not necessarily harder. I find ChatGPT to be a great tool when I'm learning coding to help me work smarter. All right. Thank you so much. So I'm open to questions now.
Fantastic talk. You covered a lot of ground. We do have a question from Elsie.
Cool. Elsie, it's interesting how you had pushback from partners on showing certain data that they didn't want to emphasize. How did you have that conversation? And do you have any tips for negotiating that? Yeah, so I was in the meeting with my colleague Mohit, who does a lot of work with data analysis, and they push back by pointing to different studies that have been done that didn't necessarily come out with the same data. And we were able to just explain that, like, the parameters that we changed, the assumptions that we changed, and why we believed in the analysis that we were doing. Luckily, our colleagues really trust us. And once they heard us out, they understood where that was coming from. But there was that pivot to, okay, then how do we look at this data in a new way to help us focus our work? So instead of just, instead of just like being okay with having that, that one number that they were uncomfortable with, or the number of states that the data didn't look good, we dug into the data deeper, and we were able to look at that lowest 20% of wage earners and come up with some information that was going to help our colleagues kind of to focus their work more.
Well, as we wait for people to pop more questions in, Nikki says +1 for using ChatGPT for regex. I agree. Anne has asked, how do you attract work for your consulting business that you do outside of your regular job?
That's a great question, and something I'm still working on. A lot of it is networking and putting yourself out there in that way. So making sure people know that I'm doing data visualization work on the side, connections I have through NRDC. So people that I've worked with in the past within NRDC, letting them know that I also do this work freelance if they ever need something that, wouldn't require my 9-to-5 work. And showing up at DataViz events, honestly, making connections at Outlier Conference and data events in NYC, where I live, have been helpful.
John had a very similar question. How do you go about networking, et cetera, between projects? Perhaps you just answered it.
Yeah, well, that I think I also I joined the mentorship program at through Data Visualization Society of 2 years ago. And my mentor through that program has introduced me to people. I also started teaching through that. So I taught data visualization in a grad program at Queens College last spring through that connection. Networking can be tricky, and I don't always want to do it for sure. But I think putting in the time to almost like in critique, like actively listen to people and share about what you're interested in doing, can't really be beat.
Absolutely. RB has asked, have you had situations with stakeholders who say, I want to see everything or show all the data because it's all important? How do you deal with that?
Definitely. Or they want to just show a ton of data. And sometimes I've dealt with it in different ways. Sometimes I will just put it all out there and show them how busy it can get, and show them how confusing it is when you have so much information on one page. Sometimes they want to see the data because they have people at their organization who are also analysts and want to, dig into it themselves. It depends on the partners that we're working with. So, if the data agreements allow that I can share all of that information, I will. If they don't, I will do my best to share what I can. But typically, and this is kind of like from my design background, you can share 3 examples, the one that you really like, the one that has maybe like too little data, and the one that has like way too much data. And people can kind of come to their own conclusions.
Fair enough. Priya has asked, what data events have you enjoyed going to in New York City?
Great question, Priya. I went to the Data Vandals show this past weekend. That was really cool. It was at
Cooper.
Yeah, you know where it was, don't you?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, Union Square Cooper something building.
Cooper Union, yeah, the university. It was really interesting. It combined like art and history of New York City. Loved that. And I've been to and had an exhibit or participated in an exhibit through the Climate Museum. So that it used to be on Governor's Island, and then it was like had a bunch of different locations through galleries, but they've done some really interesting exhibits. Like they had an ongoing video simulation of ice sheets in the Arctic. So just like, a camera panning down and down and down to all these different ice sheets. And it's a different way to share data. And it really brings on a feeling in a different way than charts and graphs might. So those are 2. I'll keep thinking.
I'll also make a plug for like the DVS X New York City local chapter. They were kind of quiet over the summer with everyone traveling, but hopefully fall events will start coming back. And these tend to be like networking events, seminars, kind of similar to this, where somebody gives a talk about a project that they've done. It's worth checking out for sure and keeping an eye on their Eventbrite profile. Next up, Nikki has asked, thank you for volunteering your time to chat with us. How was your experience in the MICA Master's Program? What was the most valuable thing you gained from it?
Great question, Nikki. I really loved my experience with MICA's Master's Program. I think with most master's programs and most education, you'll get out of it what you put into it. I decided to go because a coworker had also gone to MICA's master's program in data analysis and visualization. And she is now like the head of our data viz team. So I saw her upward trajectory. I saw her getting more experience and opportunities, and I followed that path. Some of the best things I got I got a lot out of it. For me, I need like structured work in order to get projects into my portfolio. I am so impressed by people who can like come up with an idea or do one of those like Makeover Monday projects or, you know, create stuff in their free time. I am not like that. I really need some structure and focus, whether it's like at work or with a side project, to get a portfolio piece. So that was huge for me. I also really enjoyed the professors that I had. Everyone, I'd gone to taken classes at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, SVA, which also has like all of the professors are active in their fields. And I find, I just find that to be a really valuable way to learn from people who are doing the work on the ground. What else was really valuable? What was that?
The cohort.
My cohort. Yep. My cohort was really great. I have to say, we were on Slack all the time. When we talk about critique, like I got great critique from my cohort that made my work, you know, immensely better. Some really creative people in my group. One of my cohort mates had this incredible capstone project where he came up with this entire museum display. He took the work of the I'm going to get this wrong, the journals of Emily Dickinson and digitized them, like created this whole data frame and then made a whole museum display about it, which was just incredible and really inspiring to see. So yeah, the cohort was awesome.
I feel like I interrupted you in case there was
No. That was great. I will again say, you know, like it depends on what's going on in your life. There were people who had to, you know, take a break part of the way through because they had a kid or a family emergency or a change in work. So it's different for every person and might take a different amount of time.
One of the things you touched on was the structure that the micro program provided for you. And that kind of ties into a question that I had about balancing working for a 9-to-5 and freelancing. It's like, how do you find time? How do you find that structure in your life to also work on freelancing projects?
Yeah. When I was in school, freelancing definitely took a backseat. A lot of it was scheduling and making calendars of like when projects would be due, when I might have some extra time to work on things, and really sticking to them. I would also, you know, I get a lunch hour every day at work. Like my lunch hour was reading for Micah. So it was like finding those gaps in time where I might be like scrolling on my phone or going for a walk or something and making it, you know, doubling down on schoolwork. But yeah, I think focusing on project management, getting into tools like Asana were really helpful. Figuring out deadlines and who needed to be contacted with projects, work projects, or what I needed to do next for a MICA project.
Fair enough. One of the things you touched on in your presentation was when you receive feedback or critique on projects, don't defend, don't get defensive. But this is something I personally struggle with, is the urge to not necessarily defend, but explain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about balancing that, negotiating, tiptoeing around, defending versus explaining when it's useful, when it's not, tips and tricks, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes explaining is valuable, but I find that if you have to explain your work, it's not clear enough to your audience. And maybe your audience is someone else who has more information. So that would be like a good time to explain, like, well, my audience already knows this, so X, Y, and Z. But instead, I think like turning it back and asking more questions on the person who's doing critiques is a really good way to get to the heart of what they're trying to say. And also redirect that want to push back, because I have the same thing. But if you can say like, okay, where did you get that information? Or what did you do first when you went on this website or dashboard? Or what was confusing to you? How did you understand this? If you start asking questions, you can get people to start digging deeper and thinking more about how they are interacting with your work. And I think that's really enlightening, because not everyone's going to see something that you've been working on for however long, 10 weeks, in the same way that you are seeing it.
I see Anne has a question, but before I do that, I want to follow up on a second question for this. How do you structure getting critiques? Do you, when you're presenting your ideas to stakeholders and you're going through, do you have do you structure it so you present the ideas and what you're thinking first and then ask for critiques later? Or do you just give them the material and say, hey, love your feedback. Here are the questions that I have for you. Like, what does that process, that pipeline look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends, because I don't always have final say over how my work will be presented for feedback. For example, I'm working on a website with a bunch of data visualizations in it right now for a network of advocates across the country. And, I'm this freelance person coming in to help with this project. And these people all are doing this as like a side project to their normal jobs. They are really stretched for time. I wanted to present it on a meeting call to them, provide background and information, and ask a list of questions of feedback we were looking for, but that was not possible. So we had to just email out the draft to them so they could go through it at their own pace. One thing that I find when you give people a lot of time to review is that everyone wants to have a say. Everyone wants to hear their voice or have their voice be heard. And so you often start hearing this feedback that like doesn't seem so important or doesn't really align with what you were thinking about what feedback you were looking for. So I try to not provide too much time for that. However, sometimes it's just inevitable. I would prefer to have a call or meet one-on-one with someone, present the information in front of them, give them whatever spiel, like where it might live, who our audience is, that kind of stuff, any other background information that the audience might have, and give some areas to focus on. So we're not looking at, any question in the world. I want to know, 3 things, whatever the questions are, and allowing them to provide that targeted feedback rather than just being really broad with it.
Fantastic advice. Thank you. All right. And do you feel your micro-credential is more beneficial to your career or your work experience?
I would rather not have to choose. I mean, after I graduated, this isn't necessarily the case for everyone, but I got a promotion after I graduated, and I'm in a much better position that where I like the work that I'm doing a lot better. But I also would not have built out the site, the Beyond the Opioid Crisis site that I built out. I wouldn't have had experience in R at all, or coding, really. I don't know if I would have taken those data camp courses on my own. So it's tough to say. I think my work got much better as a result of it. And I think the credential has definitely helped with, looking for jobs and also the job that I'm at.
Kind of along those lines-ish, I noticed the tab of your presentation was Q&A with a quote unquote expert. And no shade, but it had me thinking about like imposter syndrome and dealing with that. And I was wondering if that's something that you struggle with, if you had any advice for people who are early in their careers who might be struggling with imposter syndrome.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely don't consider myself an expert. I think that I have a lot of experience, but expert to me is like, you know, um, an artist at the end of their career or towards the end of their career, or someone who's been, I don't know. Imposter syndrome, I think, is, like a reality, but I read some article about imposter syndrome that's also stuck with me, and about like, society's expectations on people of different races, genders, and how that reflects what imposter syndrome is. And I think I'm really energized and emboldened, maybe, by the work that I am doing, and by like continuing to have new projects that are challenging me. And so I try to really have a growth mindset. And even if I'm not an expert now, like, that just means there's more space to grow, more things to learn. Um, I think it's hard to deal with that imposter syndrome. Like, I've definitely had my moments. Definitely while I was at Micah, I had a lot of moments like that. But yeah, I just don't think it's going to go away for me. So I try to reframe it as, learning opportunities or chances to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that's helped me is just recognizing that everybody, no matter where they are, no matter how long they've been in it, struggles with imposter syndrome. We're all in this boat together.
Oh, yeah. I know. I hear, mega celebrities or these brilliant people, professors who, say that they're still anxious before a class or before a presentation, before going on stage. And it shocks me sometimes. So yeah, we're all in this together. And if they're not, that's a red flag.
Yes. All right. Nikki has asked, how do you determine when a project is finished? I feel like I can sit there and tweak things forever sometimes, especially in personal portfolio projects when there's no real deadline.
Yes. So much that. And I struggle with that a lot. I think, like, sounds like you might be a perfectionist like me. And I think getting things critiqued really helps with that. I can always like go back to I'm doing it right now where I'm reviewing some of my portfolio work and like wanting to change things. But remember that like your old work is valid and, descriptive of where you were at in a moment in time. You don't need to update it. And if you continue with like the critique process, I think you'll get things to a place where you feel comfortable with them when you stop taking people's critiques. Like, when you keep hearing feedback from people and you're like, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to take that into consideration. And when you start getting those things, when you start hearing or having that voice in your head get a little louder, I think you get a little bit more confident. One other thing I'll say about that, sometimes I have trouble when starting a project because I'm like, how sketchy of a sketch can I share with someone? Does it have to be, will this be clear enough for them to understand where I'm trying to go with this project? And then I can clean up a sketch till it's, on to the second or third phase of what a project would look like. But my client or the person I'm working with might not want to go down that route. So I've spent all this time getting to this like really great sketch when I should have just shown them my crummy, 3-4 ideas so that we could, take out all that time and just focus on a shared idea. So I think sharing work earlier and often for those critiques is a really great way to tamp down that perfectionism. and get a better sense of like what it means for you to have a completed project.
Kind of along those lines, real quick, where do you get that feedback? Was it from your MICA cohort mates? But before then, like, who did you turn to? What resources, what communities did you use to get feedback and critique?
Great question. I think like honestly on Instagram, I've like made design friends randomly that I would reach out to. People in classes that I've taken at SVA or Pratt in New York City, I'll reach out to them. I mean, I'll ask my brothers, I will ask friends, I will ask, especially if it's something where the audience is more broad, where it's like, if the audience is someone older, I will ask my parents because they're in that set of people that we want to understand this information. So I'm not shy to ask like my boyfriend for help, my mom, my anybody, dog, anybody. But if I'm like looking for really specific targeted feedback, I'm going to people that I know from my cohort. I'm going to like colleagues that I know that have experience in this, my mentor, those kinds of people.
I'll also make a plug for like the DVS feedback channels for projects that are a little bit more conceptualized. I've gotten good feedback there. All right.
Me too.
Jin has asked, I know you went in specifically to improve your programming skills into MICA, but were there people in your cohort who are coming from a data analytics background and were there to improve the artistic part of the viz?
Yes, definitely. I think the people in my cohort were like a broad spectrum of people. So there were people with a design background, an art background, and then people with coding skills, with analysis skills, people that had been working like in data analysis for 10 years and we're really trying to get across that messaging, the design, the artistic part of visualization. So it ran the gamut. There were people, on opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think that helped everyone. I think, with critiques, with feedback, like having people who were on both sides of that spectrum and all in between allowed for much more robust criticism.
And this is not a Q&A with me, but like I was one of those people. I joined the MICA program coming from more of a data analytics STEM background, wanting to improve my art and my design. And so if you have any particular questions about my own experience, shoot me a DM. Happy to talk about my experience with the MICA program as well. John has asked, favorite teacher / mentor or book?
Oh, is this like a data viz book?
Sure, just to narrow the scope.
Yeah. Okay, I have Du Bois's Portraits of Visualizing Black America. I will look at that for inspiration, like often. What else do I have over here? Oh, quick plug for this one. This one was really cool. Extra Bold. Was really interesting and really pretty. Great graphic design and data viz book. Also has really good examples in there. And Storytelling with Data was a book that really helped me figure out like story arcs and how best to present information. So Storytelling with Data, I think it's like NAFLIC, KNAFLIC. That one really was fantastic. Professors or mentors. My mentor is Dane Wu, Danne Wu, who is like really smart in the artificial intelligence world, and a professor at Queen's College now, also does freelance work. He's fantastic. All of my professors were really cool and really inspiring. Amy, I got to start out with Amy, and she just like really drove that passion and excitement for what was to come throughout the rest of the semester or rest of the program.
Agreed. Job day clarify any type if you have a
any type of.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a big Stephen King fan, so I really like scary, like horror books. I just read another scary one, The Final Girl Support Group, which I really liked. That was really fun. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking for book recommendations from anyone else too. So feel free to throw them in the Q&A.
Maybe you have time for one last question in the chat, but before we get to that, since it hasn't come in yet, do you have any words of advice for people just starting out?
Yeah, I think that growth mindset is really important to have. Like, you're going to mess up. You're going to feel overwhelmed by all the information that's out there. Or feel, if you're like me, you might feel like inadequate looking at some of the incredible work that people in the Data Visualization Society and in this field are doing. But know that like that is the culmination of years and years of work and failed projects left and right, and work that they really didn't like, and maybe even in that project decisions that they didn't want to have to make. And give yourself grace and get excited about small things. I remember when I first started coding, I like making anything happen felt like magic. And every time I was able to do something new, it was like opening up a whole new world. So give yourself grace and be excited.
Absolutely. Fantastic advice. Thank you. Yeah, I've been coding for years. I still celebrate the small wins when the code does exactly what I wanted to do, or an even error on the first try. But thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story and your experience. Even though you don't consider yourself an expert, this was all fantastic advice. Thank you so much.
So glad to be here.
Absolutely. All right. So in spiel, if you really enjoyed this, if you're not familiar at all with DVS, Data Visualization Society, we don't know we necessarily explain the acronym. Be sure to check us out. We have a website, Slack, on all the socials. And if you like this event, it happens every month, Q&A with an expert. And our other events include Tea Times, which is just a networking event. Come meet other early career folks in data viz and start building your community. We also have a co-working session, so you can set that time to sit down and work on your projects. Find that time in the day. We've blocked it out for you at least once a month. And then also a readers club, so we can read books like John's recommendation, Data Feminism, as his recommendation of good books. So come join us at the end of the month for our readers club. And with that, I'll let you all get on with your Fridays. So happy Friday, everyone. Hope you enjoy the weekend and hopefully see you around.
Thank you.